August 6, 1945. Dawn light flickered over the tiled rooftops of Hiroshima, casting long shadows across narrow streets where children cycled to school and vendors arranged fish on wooden stalls. The city hummed with the fragile normalcy of wartime. Japan. Schoolgirls drilling with bamboo spears, civil defense wardens scanning the skies, factory workers pedaling to munitions plants. But above the haze of the inland sea, something moved. A silver aircraft, smooth, unscarred, and impossibly high, etched a contrail into the morning blue. Below, few noticed. Those who did assumed it was a reconnaissance plane, one of the many that prowled Japanese skies without opposition. For weeks, American bombers had shifted their patterns, first firebombing Tokyo, then Nagoya, then the shipyards of Kure. Yet Hiroshima had been spared. To many, it felt like an omen, or perhaps a reprieve. Few could imagine that their city had been selected for an experiment that would sear its name into history. Months earlier, a different kind of rain had fallen over Japan. White slips of paper, fluttering like snow, drifted down on the breeze before firestorms arrived. Printed in careful Japanese characters, the leaflets bore a stark warning. American, air power would annihilate certain cities unless civilians evacuated. Entire neighborhoods watched them fall from the sky, children racing to collect them. Parents frowning at the black and white diagrams of B-29 bombers and their targets. Some leaflets listed specific towns, others hinted at a weapon of terrible new power. It was a psychological tactic designed to puncture a nation's resolve without firing a shot. Yet for the people who bent to pick up those papers, it was a puzzle wrapped in fear. Were the Americans bluffing? Or were they capable of something far beyond the fire raids that had already turned 67 cities into embers? This tension, the gap between paper promises and roaring fire, defined the summer of 1945 in Japan. By then, the war was all but lost. American submarines throttled shipping lanes. B-29 superfortresses had flattened city after city. The Imperial Navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Yet propaganda and censorship had sealed most civilians off from the truth. State radio claimed each setback was a tactical withdrawal. Newspapers urged more sacrifice. When the first leaflets appeared, some thought they were clever forgeries by Japanese dissidents. Others whispered they were divine warnings. Few understood that this was the culmination of a new kind of warfare, psychological operations scaled to an entire nation. In the skies above, the Americans had shifted their strategy. Under General Curtis LeMay, the 20th Bomber Command wielded its super fortresses like sledgehammers, burning cities at night and striking infrastructure by day. Yet even LeMay, hardened by the fires of Tokyo and Dresden, recognized the power of anticipation. A leaflet could do what 1,000 bombs could not: sow doubt in the minds of civilians, fracture the obedience that fed the war machine. In July 1945, as Allied leaders met at Potsdam to issue their final ultimatum, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched the largest leaflet campaign in history. Millions of copies poured from the presses in Saipan and Tinian, shipped alongside bombs and fuel drums. The printing presses rattled day and night, translating threats into the language of a people raised on imperial myth. Imagine a summer evening in Nagasaki. Air raid sirens wail, yet nothing comes. Then from the dark belly of a lone bomber, bundles spill out. They burst open like seed pods, scattering thousands of leaflets. A farmer on the city's edge looks up, squinting against the paper snow. His daughter runs out, grabbing one mid-air. It shows a map of Japan, black dots marking targeted cities. The text warns civilians to flee. It claims the emperor cannot protect them. To read it is to feel the state's protective veil rip, but to obey it is treason. Police confiscate the leaflets where they can, but the damage is done. A rumor takes hold that Americans are choosing targets carefully, that a list exists somewhere dictating which cities will burn and which will live. People begin whispering about Hiroshima's strange survival. Why, they ask, does our city remain untouched? Some think it's because of shrines in the emperor's favor. Others believe it's a testing ground. The leaflets make every day a coin toss. Meanwhile, on the airstrips of the Marianas, the men who drop these leaflets see themselves as technicians of war. The B-29s they fly are enormous machines of aluminum and rivets, each with a wingspan wider than a football field, their 4 Wright R-3350 engines thundering at takeoff. Inside, the bomb bays can hold incendiary clusters or, just as easily, pallets of paper. Crews joke grimly about the contradiction. One day they rain down fire, the next they drop words. Yet they understand the effect. Intelligence reports trickle back through intercepted Japanese communications. Police stations report increased civilian anxiety, scattered evacuations, breakdowns in factory attendance. Leaflets are working, not as a mercy but as a weapon. Still, not every Japanese civilian can believe the warnings. Years of propaganda have painted Americans as demons who mutilate captives. Some assume the leaflets are psychological tricks to flush people into the open for strafing. Others clutch them as proof of American civility, a strange flicker of humanity in total war. Mothers tuck them into drawers as talismans, thinking perhaps the paper itself can ward off destruction. But the bombs still come, and when they do, there is no warning but the sirens. On the morning of August 6th, that duality reached its climax. As Enola Gay climbed toward 31,000 feet, no leaflets fell over Hiroshima. The warning had been delivered weeks before in general terms, but not on this day, not for this weapon. Below, civilians still believed they were safe. Schoolchildren swept firebreaks. Commuters rode trams through quiet streets. A few miles away, anti-aircraft crews scanned the sky but held their fire. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A single object fell, smooth, metallic, and humming with a secret power no one below could imagine. For the narrator looking back, the juxtaposition is haunting. Leaflets and bombs, paper and fire, warnings fluttering like snow, then cities erupting in light hotter than the sun. This was not an accident, but a doctrine. Psychological warfare sought to prepare, to terrify, to erode the will to fight. Yet when the ultimate weapon arrived, the warning ceased. Hiroshima became not just a target, but a statement. The leaflets had lulled some into believing in mercy, and so the detonation shattered not only buildings, but assumptions about the rules of war. Far beyond Japan, military strategists watched closely. Leaflet campaigns, precision bombing, atomic strikes, each was a step toward total psychological domination of the enemy. What began as an experiment in persuasion became an instrument of annihilation. In the years to come, the idea that you could warn and then destroy would echo through Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf. But in the summer of 1945, it was still raw, still unfolding, still measured in paper slips, drifting over burning neighborhoods. The camera lingers on a single leaflet, half burned, fluttering in the hot wind after the blast. Its printed words are still legible, a warning to evacuate, a plea to survive. Around it lies rubble, twisted steel, and shadows etched into stone. This is the paradox of the final year of the Pacific War, a nation told both to flee and to stand firm, an enemy that offered both mercy and destruction, and above it all, the silver bombers still circling, engines droning, choosing who would live and who would die. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the brink of ruin. Once the spearhead of imperial conquest from China to the South Pacific, it now resembled a besieged fortress, its walls crumbling under relentless bombardment. Across the Pacific, American industrial might had matured into a juggernaut of aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and submarines prowling shipping lanes. Each day more cities disappeared beneath waves of incendiary bombs, yet the war machine in Tokyo continued to insist on honorable resistance. In this crucible of desperation, psychological warfare became as vital as steel and fire. The leaflets printed by the millions were not afterthoughts but part of a larger plan to erode Japan's will to fight from the inside out. The story began years earlier, as B-29 superfortresses entered service in 1944. Unlike any bomber before them, these machines could fly higher, faster, and farther, carrying heavier payloads over oceans that had once been natural barriers. The very geography that had protected the Japanese homeland now became a corridor for American bombers. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, once obscure dots on the map, became vast forward bases, bristling with runways long enough to launch squadrons of the new bombers. From these coral airstrips, the U.S. Army Air Forces could strike at will, shifting from purely military targets to the civilian and industrial heart of Japan. It was not merely a campaign of destruction, but also of messaging. Leaflet operations in Europe had already proven the value of psychological pressure. Over France and Germany, Allied bombers had scattered millions of pamphlets predicting attacks, undermining Nazi propaganda, and even providing coded escape instructions for resistance fighters. In Japan, however, the stakes were higher and the cultural barriers steeper. The imperial state demanded absolute loyalty, framing surrender as the ultimate disgrace. The military regime controlled the press and radio, blunting bad news and amplifying heroic myths. Into this tightly sealed information space, American planners sought to drop fragments of doubt. Each leaflet was a blade of paper designed to pierce an armored mind. The American approach combined massive air raids with carefully crafted texts. Teams of translators and cultural experts, many of them Japanese Americans who had fled or been interned, composed messages designed to sound authoritative yet not alien. They named real cities. They cited actual raids. They promised that those who evacuated would live. This was not only a tactical warning, but a moral theater, an attempt to claim the high ground of civilization even as incendiaries turned wooden houses into ash. Military leaders argued that the warnings would hasten surrender and reduce the need for an invasion that might kill millions. Others saw them as an experiment in the manipulation of mass psychology on an unprecedented scale. At the heart of this strategy stood the B-29, its cavernous bomb bays equally capable of holding death or paper. The superfortress was more than a machine. It was a statement of industrial supremacy. Each carried 12 .50 caliber machine guns, a pressurized cabin, and a range of over 3,000 miles. Its radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, gave it the thrust to rise above most Japanese fighters and flak. When it roared overhead at 30,000 feet, the sound was both distant and omnipresent, a metallic thunder echoing across city blocks. Civilians learned to distinguish its tone from smaller aircraft. That tone meant something heavy and deliberate was coming. Against this backdrop, the leaflets gained a mythic aura. Rumors spread that the Americans possessed a master list of cities slated for destruction. Some thought the leaflets were a form of gambling slip, a cruel way to make civilians guess their own fates. Others claimed that reading them aloud invited disaster, that hidden codes in the text cursed those who disobeyed. The truth was both simpler and more chilling. The Americans were experimenting with a new layer of warfare, one that blended technology, propaganda, and mass trauma. Inside Japan's leadership circles, panic mingled with denial. Reports filtered in from police and local officials that civilians were hoarding the leaflets, whispering about evacuation, questioning the emperor's ability to protect them. The Home Ministry ordered confiscations. Secret police patrolled neighborhoods, tearing leaflets from hands, but could not erase their content from memory. In some cases, the warnings spurred evacuations that later saved lives. In others, they sowed confusion that slowed war production as workers fled factories. The leaflet's power was not in immediate compliance, but in the erosion of faith, a slow chipping at the bedrock of national unity. Meanwhile, American strategists watched for signs of a larger break in Japanese morale. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Allied leaders issued an ultimatum: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Behind closed doors, military planners discussed a weapon that might make good on that threat in an instant. But until it was ready, they continued to escalate conventional bombing and leaflet campaigns, hoping either to trigger a surrender or to soften the population for what was to come. It was a grim calculus measured in tons of bombs and millions of printed words. The cultural dimension cannot be overstated. In a society that prized group cohesion and sacrifice, the idea of individualized warnings struck at the heart of Japanese identity. A leaflet offered a choice: flee or stay, live or die, that the state itself refused to acknowledge. This choice was profoundly destabilizing. Families argued over what to do. Some fled to rural areas, abandoning jobs and homes. Others stayed, convinced that loyalty would be rewarded. In this way, the leaflets functioned as microcosms of the larger war, a clash between industrial-scale modernity and a centuries-old code of obedience. In the air bases of the Marianas, the operations unfolded like clockwork. Huge rolls of paper arrived by ship from the mainland, inked by rotary presses, bundled into stacks. Crews packed them into the bomb bays with the same care as explosives. Once aloft over pre-selected cities, they opened chutes and watched the bundles burst apart. For a few seconds, the sky filled with white. Then gravity took over, scattering messages onto rooftops, fields, and rivers. The crews knew their targets only as coordinates, yet they imagined the scenes below. Children looking up, officials scrambling, the strange stillness before the sirens. It was war as spectacle, conducted from 6 miles up. This was the context into which Hiroshima and Nagasaki fell. By early August, these two cities represented more than military targets. They were symbols, one of Japan's supposed invulnerability, the other of its industrial heartbeat. Both had been spared major firebombing, perhaps to preserve them for a demonstration of something unprecedented. Civilians noticed. Why, they asked, did these cities remain untouched while others burned nightly? The leaflets only deepened the mystery, hinting at future destruction but never naming the weapon. In this vacuum of knowledge, rumors bloomed like wildfire. Some said the Americans had a bomb so large it could flatten a city in a single strike. Others laughed at the idea as science fiction. In retrospect, the leaflets were both a warning and a lure. They demonstrated American reach and intelligence, yet also suggested a kind of mercy. They set up an expectation of choice and survival. When the atomic bombs fell, that expectation shattered, amplifying the psychological impact beyond the physical devastation. The context of summer 1945, total war, mass leafleting, and the dawning of the nuclear age ensured that the shockwaves were as much in the mind as in the rubble. This was the stage upon which the drama unfolded. A nation bombed yet warned, a weapon announced yet unimaginable, a people caught between propaganda and paper snow. Each leaflet was a whisper of the future, each B-29 a shadow of the coming apocalypse. Together they formed the prelude to the moment when war would change forever, and the world would enter an age where words could no longer shield anyone from fire brighter than the sun. Long before the atomic age's dawn flashed over Hiroshima, an invisible weapon had already been deployed across the skies of Japan, one forged not of uranium or TNT, but of language, intelligence, and timing. While the Japanese military still conceived of war as a test of steel and spirit, American planners had embraced a new dimension: information as ordnance. The leaflets, seemingly harmless slips of paper, were the surface of something deeper, a coordinated psychological offensive that turned Japan's rigid social fabric into a liability. Where German blitzkrieg had combined tanks and radios, the US war in the Pacific combined bombers and words. This was the hidden advantage, a fusion of total air superiority with an unprecedented reach into the minds of enemy civilians. In Tokyo's military headquarters, staff officers pored over intercepted Allied broadcasts, trying to decode intent. But the leaflets were different, physical, unavoidable, falling into kitchens and schoolyards. They represented not mere propaganda, but a breach. Each one carried intelligence about American targeting priorities, phrased as a warning, but designed to seed terror. The Japanese military, accustomed to controlling narratives through censorship, found itself powerless to prevent these intrusions. Police could seize the paper, but the message had already landed in thousands of hands. This asymmetry, control from above versus chaos below, was the essence of the American psychological campaign. The Americans had learned from Europe. Their leaflets had sometimes failed because they were too abstract or unbelievable. Over Japan, the language shifted to specificity. Names of real cities, threats with dates attached, diagrams of bombers and target zones. A pattern emerged. The Americans warned certain cities, then struck others, then left some untouched. This randomness bred paranoia. Civilians began guessing which warnings were genuine, trying to divine the logic of the bombers. In doing so, they participated in their own terror, becoming statisticians of survival. The hidden advantage lay not just in the paper, but in the algorithm of dread. At the core of this effort stood the U.S. Army Air Force's Psychological Warfare Division, a small but potent node embedded within the vast bomber command structure. Working in conjunction with the Office of War Information, these teams analyzed Japanese newspapers, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations to shape each wave of leaflets. They knew which factories employed which workers, which neighborhoods housed key industries, which cities were evacuation hubs. Their goal was not merely to warn, but to create a predictive model of Japanese behavior under pressure. In modern terms, it was data-driven warfare, an early form of behavioral analytics applied from 30,000 feet. One of the campaign's masterstrokes was its credibility. By accurately naming some future targets and then actually bombing them, the Americans built a grim reputation for honesty. When a leaflet named your city, you had reason to believe fire was coming. This credibility magnified the effect of later, more ambiguous warnings. It also served as a moral shield for American leaders, who could argue they had given civilians a chance to flee. In reality, many lacked the means to escape or the freedom to choose. But the appearance of mercy mattered strategically. It cast the Americans as the side of reason in a war of fanaticism, even as their bombs obliterated entire districts. Meanwhile, Japan's defenders lacked any equivalent tool. Their air force had been gutted, their radar networks thin, their public messaging constrained by ideology. They could not counterwarn American cities. They could not penetrate American information space. Their only psychological weapon, kamikaze attacks, played differently abroad, being seen less as terror than as fanaticism. Thus, the leaflets marked a reversal. Where once Japan had dominated Asian populations with fear, it now found itself on the receiving end of a fear campaign calibrated by industrial science. On the ground, the hidden advantage manifested in small, intimate ways. A factory foreman in Kyoto reads a leaflet listing targeted cities and notes Kyoto's absence. He reassures his workers, production continues. In Hiroshima, a teacher reads the same leaflet and wonders why her city remains off the list. She whispers to colleagues that perhaps Hiroshima is safe. This perception, shaped by American decisions, affects factory output, civil defense drills, and evacuation patterns. Multiply that by millions, and the American planners had, in effect, turned Japanese society into a chessboard, moving pieces without direct force. The leaflets also worked in tandem with technological superiority. B-29s flying at altitudes beyond most anti-aircraft fire delivered their messages with impunity. Japanese civilians looked up and saw not only the future of warfare but also their own impotence. The planes did not dogfight. They appeared, released their cargo, and vanished into the upper air. The combination of unreachable bombers and ominous warnings created a sense of omniscience, the idea that the Americans saw everything, knew everything, and could strike anywhere. This impression was itself a weapon, eroding the cultural cornerstone of imperial protection. In secret Allied briefings, commanders discussed the leaflets as part of progressive pressure. The idea was to push Japan toward surrender without a bloody invasion. By demonstrating both destructive capability and a willingness to warn civilians, the Allies hoped to fracture the government's grip. This was more than humanitarian impulse. It was calculated leverage. A population convinced that its rulers could no longer shield it might, in theory, pressure those rulers to capitulate. Whether this hope was realistic in a militarized society remained an open question, but it gave shape to the American strategy in those final months. The hidden advantage also resided in timing. Leaflets often preceded major raids by days or weeks, creating a period of dread in which normal life unraveled. Shops closed, factories slowed, trains filled with evacuees. Even when the bombs didn't fall, the disruption itself achieved a military effect by clogging logistics and draining manpower. And when the bombs did fall, they validated the warnings, reinforcing the cycle. This interplay of anticipation and devastation amplified psychological impact far beyond what tonnage alone could produce. Perhaps the most subtle aspect of the campaign was its moral inversion. By offering warnings, the Americans could claim restraint, yet the very act of warning intensified fear. Civilians who received leaflets faced a dilemma: believe the enemy and risk arrest, or obey their own government and risk incineration. This choice fractured communities, eroded trust, and blurred the line between protector and destroyer. It was psychological warfare at its purest, placing the burden of survival on the enemy's conscience. In this way, the leaflets foreshadowed the atomic strikes. They conditioned the Japanese public to expect extraordinary devastation, while leaving the exact nature of the threat vague. When the bomb fell on Hiroshima, Without a preceding leaflet drop that morning, the shock was multiplied. The Americans had broken their own pattern, and in doing so magnified the sense of betrayal and awe. The hidden advantage, therefore, was not only in having the weapon but in scripting the psychological environment into which it would detonate. Looking back, one can see how this approach anticipated the doctrines of later decades: shock and awe, network-centric warfare, the use of information as a force multiplier. But in 1945, it was experimental, improvised, and chillingly effective. While Japanese civilians clung to rituals, newspapers, and rumors, American analysts read aerial photographs and interception reports, adjusting their messages with each sortie. The sky became a billboard for the enemy's will, and paper became a shrapnel of the mind. Above the burning cities, a B-29 banks, its crew watching the bundles drift down. They know that tomorrow or the next day they may return with fire instead of paper, yet they also know the paper itself wounds in a way fire cannot. It corrodes certainty, hollows out courage, and whispers that resistance is futile. That whisper, multiplied millions of times, was America's hidden advantage in the war's final act. From the ground, the paper rain appeared almost weightless, a fragile counterpoint to the shriek of sirens. But behind each leaflet was a machinery of engineering and logistics as formidable as any tank column. The very act of dropping warnings over Japan required innovations in aircraft, printing, navigation, and coordination on a scale unseen in history. To understand the depth of the American campaign is to see how technology and organization fused to make ideas as deliverable as bombs. Begin with the airplane itself, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. At its debut, it was the most advanced bomber ever built, pressurized, armed with remote-controlled gun turrets, and powered by 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, producing over 2,200 horsepower apiece. Each engine turned a 4-bladed 16-foot propeller, lifting a 141-foot wingspan. Fully loaded, a B-29 weighed nearly 140,000 pounds, yet could climb to altitudes above 30,000 feet, cruising at 220 miles per hour, over a combat radius of 2,600 miles. These numbers meant something concrete over Japan: the ability to carry either 10 tons of incendiaries or thousands of pounds of printed paper, and to do so from bases more than 1,000 miles away. Japanese fighters struggled to reach such heights, and their anti-aircraft guns lost accuracy in the thin upper air. The Superfortress was not simply an aircraft. It was a flying factory of destruction or persuasion. Inside, the plane was divided into pressurized compartments connected by a narrow tunnel over the bomb bays. Crew members could work in shirt sleeves even at altitudes, where temperatures dropped to -40. This comfort extended mission endurance and precision. Navigators had access to cutting-edge bomb sites and celestial navigation equipment, while radio operators handled high-frequency sets powerful enough to reach command back on Tinian or Saipan. Even the defensive armament reflected engineering audacity. 5 remotely aimed turrets, controlled by analog computing sites, spitting 50-caliber rounds at approaching fighters. This combination of speed, altitude, and automation granted the B-29 virtual immunity in the campaign's early months, making it an ideal platform for psychological warfare. Yet an airplane without payload is only potential. The leaflets themselves were technical marvels of mass production. U.S. Army press units in the Marianas operated offset presses capable of turning out over 6 million copies per day. Rolls of paper arrived by Liberty ship, stacked in warehouses beside bomb fins and aviation fuel. Translators and intelligence officers labored in prefabricated huts, drafting messages in crisp Japanese kanji. Each sheet carried carefully chosen typography, avoiding ornate styles that might betray foreign origin, while maintaining readability from arm's length. The ink was waterproof, designed to survive rain as it drifted to Earth. Bundling teams packed the sheets into 500-pound loads with breakaway straps. At altitude, a single pull of a lever would release them into the slipstream, where the straps snapped and the paper blossomed like seeds. Every step was choreographed to maximize coverage. Meteorologists briefed crews on wind layers so that leaflets would scatter widely. Navigators adjusted release points miles upwind to target specific wards and factory zones. Crews calculated drift patterns with the same precision as bombing runs. In some cases, leaflet drops were paired with chaff, strips of aluminum foil used to jam radar, creating a surreal snowfall of paper and metal. This interplay of meteorology, printing, and flight planning meant the campaign operated like a weapons system. Its ammunition measured not in pounds of TNT, but in words per square mile. Another layer of technology was the data behind the messages. American analysts pored over aerial photographs, shipping records, and prisoner interrogations to map the social and industrial anatomy of each city. They knew which neighborhoods housed munitions workers, which had hospitals, which were evacuation centers. This intelligence fed into a vast card index system, the analog precursor to databases, that allowed planners to select targets and craft warnings with surgical precision. In effect, the Americans were running a psychological targeting algorithm decades before computers would formalize such things. The Japanese, by contrast, relied on pre-war anti-aircraft designs and fragmented radar coverage. Their primary gun, the Type 88 75mm, could reach only to about 26,000 feet effectively. B-29s flying at 31,000 feet were nearly untouchable. Interceptors like the Nakajima Ki-44 and Kawasaki Ki-61 strained to climb and often arrived late, short on fuel. Even when fighters reached the bombers, the remote turrets and tight formations poured out a storm of 50 caliber fire. This air dominance gave the Americans freedom to experiment. Leaflet drops could be flown in daylight at chosen altitudes without the losses that would have crippled such efforts over Germany. Inside the leaflet operations nerve center, another hidden technology pulsed, the SCR-274N, and later the NARC-3 radio sets aboard the bombers. These frequency-modulated transmitters cut through static far better than older systems, letting crews receive last-minute instructions, weather updates, or mission aborts. German forces had marveled at American FM radios in North Africa and France. Now Japan felt the same asymmetry in the sky. Clear communications meant tighter timing between bomber groups, more synchronized leaflet drops, and coordinated follow-up raids. While Japanese controllers relied on line-of-sight VHF with frequent signal loss, American crews spoke across hundreds of miles as if in the same room. The technical edge extended to the bombs themselves, or rather, to the choice of not dropping them. Leaflet bundles were designed to fit standard bomb racks, meaning crews could switch from incendiaries to paper without reconfiguring the aircraft. This modularity encouraged experimentation. A morning mission might scatter warnings, an afternoon one deliver fire. Over time, this rhythm itself became a psychological weapon. Civilians began to associate the high silver bombers not only with destruction, but with cryptic messages, an alternating pattern of threat and reprieve. Industrial capacity underpinned all of it. Boeing's assembly lines in Wichita and Renton rolled out B-29s by the hundreds, each bristling with the latest avionics. Motorola and Collins Radio produced thousands of FM sets. Printing presses churned out leaflets faster than Japanese police could burn them. This was war as a production equation, where every component, from propeller to punctuation mark, was mass-manufactured to overwhelm an enemy state. But technology alone did not create impact. It was how these tools were woven together. Imagine a night mission over Osaka. 10 B-29s fly in staggered formation. Their navigators plot wind drift using analog calculators. Bundled leaflets sit in the bays, held by quick-release shackles. At a coded signal, hatches open. Bundles tumble out, straps break, and a blizzard of paper falls toward the glowing grid of city lights below. A minute later, chaff cascades down as well, dazzling radar screens. Radio chatter confirms wind direction. Navigators adjust course for the next pass. This choreography resembles a ballet as much as a raid, each move rehearsed to exploit machinery, physics, and human perception. On the ground, the technology's effect ripples outward. Leaflets printed on tough stock survive the night dew, their ink unfaded by morning sun. Children pick them up on their way to school. Police scramble to confiscate them, but lack vehicles as gasoline rations pinch. Factory attendance dips as rumors spread. Anti-aircraft crews report new anxiety, scanning skies even when no raid follows. Thus, the technology of delivery becomes a technology of disruption. In retrospect, the leaflet campaign prefigured modern information warfare. Satellites, drones, and cyber attacks now deliver messages across borders, but the principle is the same. Combine superior platforms, data analytics, and psychological insight to shape enemy behavior. In 1945, that meant paper and bombers. Today, it means pixels and networks. Yet the blueprint is visible in the technical mastery of the B-29 era. All of this fed directly into the atomic strikes. The same navigational systems that guided leaflet drops guided the Enola Gay. The same radios that coordinated warning flights coordinated the most secret missions in history. The entire infrastructure of psychological and physical destruction converged in August 1945, when a single bomb replaced thousands of tons of paper and incendiaries. By then, Japanese civilians had been conditioned to expect American omnipotence. When Hiroshima erupted in light, it seemed less a shock from nowhere than the culmination of a technological crescendo they had been watching in the sky for months. A single leaflet fluttering in a burned street may look accidental, but it was the end point of a chain of factories, laboratories, and airfields. Its presence testified to a hidden architecture of war, where engineers, linguists, and pilots collaborated to turn information into a weapon. This was the technical deep dive of the Pacific War's final act. Machines delivering messages, messages preparing minds, minds collapsing before bombs. The dawn of August 9, 1945, broke over southern Japan with a dull, humid glow. Nagasaki's hills rose steeply from the harbor, their slopes dotted with timber houses, shrines, and workshops, feeding the city's bustling shipyards. The previous night, rumors had run like wildfire through its alleys. Rumors of Hiroshima's annihilation 3 days earlier. Rumors of a weapon beyond imagination. Rumors that the Americans had spared Nagasaki, on a list only to make an example of it next. Leaflets had been falling for weeks, warning civilians to evacuate target cities. Many still clutched them, folded and refolded, as if the thin paper could serve as a passport out of destruction. Yet the city stirred as always. Trams rattled on iron rails, students marched to school, factory whistles blew. Overhead the sky was empty, but for a few scattered clouds drifting off the East China Sea. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., air raid sirens began to moan, a rising metallic wail that had become the city's soundtrack. People glanced upward. A lone B-29 had been seen earlier, and many assumed it was another reconnaissance flight, perhaps a leaflet drop. But on board the aircraft circling high above, there were no bundles of paper this time. The plane was boxcar, and in its bomb bay lay a different cargo. The plutonium implosion device codenamed Fat Man. The target had originally been Kokura, but heavy clouds and smoke forced a diversion to Nagasaki. This improvisation meant that thousands who had read the leaflets and guessed their fate had no idea the moment had arrived. In this single flight, the entire psychology of the leaflet campaign reached its breaking point. For months, American bombers had alternated between warnings and fire. Civilians had tried to decipher patterns, to read intent from contrails. The leaflets had promised choice. Now that promise vanished. Boxcar's crew prepared their run with military precision, their navigation informed by the same systems that had guided countless leaflet missions. But unlike those missions, this one would leave no room for evacuation, no time for dread to accumulate. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The explosion that followed dwarfed even the firebombings of Tokyo and Osaka. A sphere of light blossomed over Nagasaki's Urakami Valley, brighter than the sun, its heat igniting wood and flesh alike. The blast wave crushed buildings miles from the epicenter, tearing steel from concrete, flipping streetcars like toys. In the instant of detonation, 35,000 people were killed outright. Tens of thousands more would die in the days and weeks ahead. The mushroom cloud rose in a boiling column, its stem casting an inhuman shadow across the city. And scattered among the debris, caught in eddies of superheated air, were the remnants of leaflets dropped days earlier, warnings now reduced to ash and fluttering scraps. For Japanese survivors, the shock was twofold. First came the incomprehensible destruction, and second came the realization that the pattern had broken. The Americans had not warned Nagasaki in the immediate hours before the strike. Whatever faith civilians had placed in the leaflets dissolved in that instant. If the leaflets had once seemed like a bargain, a grim pact between bomber and populace, they were now revealed as one phase of a larger psychological architecture leading to a weapon beyond imagination. From the American perspective, the Nagasaki strike illustrated the culmination of progressive pressure. Leaflets had been scattered in late July and early August across dozens of cities, including Nagasaki, naming some and hinting at others. Intelligence intercepts showed factory workers trickling away, railway schedules disrupted, and morale fraying. The Japanese high command still refused surrender, but cracks were widening. After Hiroshima, some Allied leaders debated whether the second atomic strike was necessary. Others insisted that only an unmistakable pattern, a repeated, unstoppable force, would break the imperial will. Thus, Nagasaki became both a military target and a psychological signal. On the ground in Nagasaki, first-hand accounts reveal how leaflets shaped decisions. A shipyard worker named Tanaka recalled seeing the leaflets and debating evacuation, but staying to guard his home. A schoolteacher led her pupils to the countryside, but returned alone to retrieve belongings. A factory owner dismissed the warnings as enemy tricks and ordered his workforce to remain. Each of these choices reflected an internalized calculus born of months of alternating paper and fire. When Fat Man detonated, those choices became life or death. The after-action reports compiled by U.S. intelligence painted a stark picture. Survivors described total sensory overload: the blinding flash, the impossible heat, the wind that tore roofs away like dry leaves. They also spoke of leaflets drifting in the blast's aftermath, fragments plastered to charred walls, fluttering among bodies. American analysts interpreted this as proof of the campaign's reach. Even in the apocalypse, the paper weapon left its mark. Yet privately, some questioned whether the warnings had created false hope, making the shock of the atomic bomb even more profound. At a strategic level, the Nagasaki strike accelerated Japan's collapse. By August 10th, Tokyo radioed its willingness to surrender under conditions, stunned by the second atomic detonation. The psychological architecture had done its work. Leaflet warnings, incendiary raids, Hiroshima, and now Nagasaki combined to break the narrative of imperial invincibility. In the war rooms of Washington and Guam, commanders saw confirmation that their integrated campaign of paper and fire had achieved its ultimate goal. No invasion of the home islands would be necessary. No million-man landing on Kyushu. Instead, surrender documents would be signed aboard the USS Missouri. Yet the moral ambiguity of the leaflet campaign lingered. Had the Americans truly intended to spare civilians by warning them? Or had they used the warnings to amplify terror? Did the leaflets represent a humane gesture or a psychological weapon? In Nagasaki, where thousands lay dead and the survivors stumbled through ruins clutching scorched scraps of paper, the question felt bitterly ironic. The city's destruction revealed that the leaflet campaign and the atomic bomb were not opposites, but stages of the same offensive, one designed to erode, then obliterate. Technically, the Nagasaki mission bore all the hallmarks of prior leaflet operations: high-altitude approach, navigation by radar and visual fixes, coordination by FM radio. The difference lay only in the payload. Boxcar's crew had trained for months in formation flying, bomb release and post-strike photography, skills honed during countless leaflet and bombing sorties. In this sense, the leaflet campaign had been a rehearsal for the ultimate strike, perfecting the logistical ballet that made the atomic delivery possible. For the Japanese civilian, however, the sequence appeared as a cruel game of chance. Cities warned but spared. Cities spared then annihilated. Messages promising survival followed by death. This unpredictability magnified trauma. In post-war studies, psychologists noted that survivors often described the leaflets as symbols of betrayal rather than mercy. They had believed, however faintly, that possession of a leaflet equaled a measure of safety. When that illusion broke at Nagasaki, it broke absolutely. From a broader military history standpoint, the strike on Nagasaki stands as the battle that the leaflet campaign fought for months to set up, a decisive psychological blow rather than a conventional clash of armies. No infantry advanced, no artillery thundered. The battlefield existed in the minds of civilians and leaders, mapped by warnings, rumors, and expectations. The atomic detonation was the coup de grace delivered to a morale already frayed by months of paper warfare. As the mushroom cloud dissipated into the stratosphere, The remnants of both campaigns, the physical and the psychological, mingled in the winds. Radio Tokyo announced a new type of bomb had struck Nagasaki. Leaflet fragments fluttered through smashed neighborhoods. Rescue teams moved among fires, searching for survivors under a sky still glowing with radioactive dust. In that moment, the fusion of technology, information, and destruction reached its apex. The city became a testament to how far war had evolved from battlefields of mud and trenches to invisible campaigns of mind and machine. This was the first major battle of the Leaflet strategy's endgame. It demonstrated that psychological preparation could magnify the effect of a single strike, making one weapon equal to an army. It showed that by shaping expectations, an attacker could collapse morale faster than by attrition alone. And it left behind a question that would echo through the Cold War. If paper and fire together could topple an empire, what limits remained in the age of nuclear weapons and mass communication? In the days following Nagasaki, Japan stood at the edge of surrender. Its leaders stunned, its people caught between disbelief and resignation. Within the shattered cities, the psychological toll of the American Leaflet campaign reached its final inevitable crescendo. For months, these thin slips of paper had fluttered across towns and rice fields like an invisible army, carrying threats, hints, and promises. Now, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese public could no longer read them as warnings. They were omens fulfilled. The paper war had shifted from persuasion to psychological devastation, creating an atmosphere where surrender felt not only rational, but inevitable. Strategically, the leaflets had worked as silent weapons. By summer 1945, more than 63 million of them had been dropped over Japanese cities. Each bore stark messages, lists of targeted cities, appeals to evacuate, explanations of American air power. They arrived not from faceless machines, but from a force that claimed omniscience. Japanese civilians began to believe the Americans could see everything: factories hidden under camouflage netting, troop movements along mountain roads, even the whispered thoughts of ministers in Tokyo. This perception was reinforced by the devastating accuracy of raids following each warning. Factories named in leaflets were incinerated days later. Rail yards threatened in bold print lay smoking within a week. The psychological effect was cumulative, a slow tightening of the noose. At the highest levels of government, the leaflets became subjects of heated debate. Military hardliners dismissed them as propaganda. Some even ordered civilians to ignore or destroy them. But within the imperial cabinet, a growing faction recognized their implications. Intelligence reports showed a steady erosion of public confidence. Police informants noted rising absenteeism from workplaces targeted in leaflets, a quiet exodus from urban centers, and whispered doubts about the emperor's ability to shield the people. The Americans were not simply bombing cities, they were undermining the spiritual foundation of Japan's war effort. In the barracks and on the factory floor, the psychological pressure was more intimate. Workers who had spent years believing in slogans of national unity now held scraps of enemy paper warning them of death. Mothers trying to shield their children from air raids tucked leaflets into kimonos as makeshift talismans. Some prayed over them, believing they held hidden codes or divine clues. Others cursed them as cruel tricks. In every case, the effect was the same: a fracturing of trust between the populace and the state. By providing information that the Japanese government refused to acknowledge, lists of cities marked for destruction, the leaflets positioned the Americans as more credible than Tokyo itself. This erosion of faith had direct military consequences. As more civilians fled targeted cities, industrial output faltered. Transport networks clogged with evacuees. Local officials found it harder to organize firefighting brigades or civil defense drills. When B-29s appeared, fewer and fewer Japanese believed official reassurances that their city was safe. Even before the atomic bombs, this slow breakdown contributed to Japan's inability to mount an effective defense of its homeland. Radar stations still functioned, anti-aircraft batteries still fired, but morale, the invisible foundation of any defense, was dissolving under the paper rain. On the American side, the leaflets represented more than a moral gesture. They were a calculated tool of psychological warfare, developed by analysts who studied everything from mass panic to industrial efficiency. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare branch of the U.S. Army collaborated to design messages that would inflict maximum doubt while maintaining a veneer of humanitarian concern. The dual tone, both threatening and protective, was deliberate. By warning civilians, the Americans hoped to foster a sense of betrayal toward their own government, which insisted on fighting to the bitter end. This, in turn, would pressure Tokyo to surrender, reducing the need for a costly invasion. In practice, the strategy blurred the line between compassion and coercion. The same B-29 formations that dropped leaflets by day unleashed incendiaries by night. Cities listed for destruction often found themselves ablaze within days. This cycle produced a psychological roller coaster: terror at the warning, hope in the chance to evacuate, and then despair when the bombs fell regardless. By August 1945, this pattern had so destabilized the Japanese psyche that the very concept of security evaporated. Civilians began to see survival not as a matter of obedience or defiance, but as a matter of sheer chance. The atomic bombings intensified this effect exponentially. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not simply military strikes, but existential shocks. Survivors who had once interpreted leaflets as lifelines now saw them as instruments of doom. The bombings collapsed the distinction between warned and unwarned, civilian and combatant, safe zone and target. In psychological terms, this was total. War perfected, a battle fought inside the minds of an entire nation. The Emperor's voice on the radio on August 15th, announcing surrender, was not just a political decision but a psychic release. For millions who had spent months under the paper rain, the war ended as abruptly as it had begun, with a voice from above, unchallengeable and final. The psychological toll extended to the American side as well. Aircrews, who had once believed they were sparing lives by warning civilians, began to question the morality of their missions. Some remembered the image of leaflets drifting among burning ruins, wondering whether they had offered genuine mercy or false hope. Historians later noted that the leaflet campaign foreshadowed modern concepts of shock and awe and information dominance, methods designed to paralyze an opponent before the main blow fell. In this sense, Japan in 1945 became the first laboratory of psychological warfare on a national scale. At the strategic level, the leaflets achieved what bombing alone could not. They transformed American air power into an omnipresent, almost supernatural force. Japanese citizens no longer saw B-29s as mere machines. They saw them as emissaries of an enemy who knew their names, their streets, their factories. This aura of omniscience amplified the shock of the atomic bombs, making surrender not just a political necessity, but a collective act of self-preservation. The leaflets were the whisper before the thunderclap, softening the national will so that one decisive blow could shatter it. By undermining faith in the imperial state, the campaign also reshaped post-war Japan. When the occupation began, American authorities found a populace oddly receptive to reform. The same psychological channels that had carried fear now carried relief. Propaganda had taught civilians to see American power as both destructive and informative, punishing yet instructive. This ambivalence laid the groundwork for a reconstruction that would proceed more smoothly than anyone had anticipated. In retrospect, the leaflet campaign not only hastened surrender, but helped condition Japanese society for the massive social transformation that followed. Yet the moral questions remain unresolved. Was the leaflet campaign a humane warning system or an instrument of terror? Did it save lives by prompting evacuation, or did it lure civilians into a false sense of security before annihilation? These debates echo through military ethics today. The juxtaposition of paper and fire, information and annihilation, became a template for future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to Iraq, where leaflets once again fluttered from the sky ahead of bombs and missiles. In each case, commanders cited Japan as precedent, proof that psychological preparation magnified the effect of kinetic force. In the end, the strategic and psychological impact of the American leaflet campaign lay not only in its immediate results, but in the template it set for modern warfare. By 1945, the United States had demonstrated that control of information could be as decisive as control of territory, that a nation's will to fight could be eroded from the air as surely as its factories could be burned. The Japanese civilians who collected and read those leaflets became the first witnesses to a new form of war, one fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. Even today, survivors recall the sound of leaflets fluttering down like dry rain, their edges catching sunlight, their words both alien and familiar. Some remember folding them into paper cranes, as if transforming the warnings into prayers. Others remember burning them in shame or fear, trying to erase the enemy's voice from their homes. Each memory is a fragment of the larger psychological campaign, a campaign whose echoes can still be heard in military doctrines and ethical debates worldwide. By August 1945, the paper rain had done its work. It had prepared a nation to believe the unbelievable, to fear the unimaginable, to surrender before armies even landed on its shores. In this way, the leaflets were not just warnings, but weapons, as potent in their own way as the bombs that followed. Together, paper and fire broke the spine of Imperial Japan, demonstrating a lesson that would reverberate for generations. In modern war, the battle for the mind precedes the battle for the field. The war was over, but the paper ghosts remained. In scorched streets from Tokyo to Nagasaki, fragments of American leaflets clung to burned walls and drifted in stagnant canals, their ink blurred by ash and rain. To the survivors, these scraps were relics of a strange war within a war of messages, warnings, and veiled promises. Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, marked the end of the empire's military might, but it also marked the birth of a new doctrine, the understanding that words dropped from the sky could shape the course of nations as surely as bombs. In the months following surrender, occupation authorities compiled reports on the leaflet campaign's effects. What they found was astonishing. Entire neighborhoods had been vacated days before raids, factories had slowed their output as workers fled, and local officials had grown paralyzed by uncertainty. Many Japanese civilians admitted that they trusted the leaflets more than their own government's proclamations. In effect, the United States had created a second voice of authority over Japan, one that bypassed the state and spoke directly to the people. It was not simply an air war. It was an information war, foreshadowing the network-centric conflicts of the future. Technicians and strategists in Washington and Tokyo alike pored over the lessons. They saw that technology alone was insufficient. It was the orchestration of information and force that produced decisive outcomes. The leaflets were not random acts of mercy, but part of a lattice of psychological operations, signal intelligence, and precision bombing. This lattice anticipated the Cold War's emphasis on intelligence, perception, and narrative control. In an age before the Internet, the Americans had shown that control of the information domain could tilt the battlefield long before troops arrived. The legacy also shaped how Americans understood their own power. The crews who had flown over Japan, scattering paper and fire alike, returned home to a country grappling with its new role as a superpower. Some spoke of the strange dissonance of their missions. In one moment they were messengers, in the next executioners. Historians later noted that this duality, the ability to warn and to destroy, became a defining feature of U.S. military doctrine. Leaflets over Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan would echo the same pattern, promising safety even as bombs followed. Each conflict traced its lineage back to those last desperate months over Japan. In Japan itself, the memory of the leaflets persisted as a cultural scar. Museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki display them alongside photographs of ruins and survivor testimonies. School children learn how the Americans warned and then struck, how the leaflets became both a chance at life and a symbol of betrayal. Some survivors folded them into paper cranes after the war, transforming the instruments of fear into symbols of peace. Others burned them, refusing to keep reminders of the sky's duplicity. In these small rituals, the Japanese people tried to make sense of the paradox, a weapon of paper wielded alongside a weapon of unimaginable fire. Strategically, the campaign influenced the very architecture of post-war deterrence. The atomic bomb demonstrated the ultimate kinetic force, but the leaflets demonstrated the power of narrative to shape enemy behavior. Together, they formed a prototype of what military theorists would later call shock and awe. The idea was simple but profound: overwhelm the opponent not only with superior weapons, but with superior perception, making resistance appear futile before the first strike lands. In this sense, the paper and the bomb were not opposites but complements. One prepared the psychological battlefield, the other sealed it. The Cold War made this lesson explicit. Both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in psychological operations, propaganda broadcasts, and covert influence campaigns. Leaflets fluttered again during the Korean War, this time warning Chinese and North Korean troops. In Vietnam, they reigned over the jungles, promising safe conduct to defectors and predicting attacks on Viet Cong strongholds. Decades later, in the Persian Gulf and Iraq, coalition forces dropped millions of leaflets announcing impending strikes or encouraging surrender. Each of these campaigns cited Japan 1945 as the proof of concept, the moment when a superpower learned to fuse information with firepower. Yet the legacy of the leaflet campaign is not merely military. It raises enduring ethical questions about the nature of warfare itself. Was the act of warning civilians before destruction a humanitarian gesture, or a calculated method of magnifying terror? Did it genuinely save lives, or simply manipulate hope? The blurred line between mercy and coercion became a central dilemma for international law and military ethics in the late 20th century. Even today, debates about psychological operations, information warfare, and targeted messaging echo the unresolved tension of those paper slips drifting over Japanese cities. On a human level, the campaign left an indelible mark on the survivors' sense of agency. For months they had been invited to act, to evacuate, to flee. Yet ultimately they were powerless before the scale of destruction. This feeling of powerlessness, cultivated by alternating warnings and strikes, contributed to the swift collapse of Japan's willingness to fight. In post-war interviews, some survivors admitted that by August 1945, they no longer believed in any form of defense. They simply waited for the next blow. The campaign had achieved what generals call breaking the enemy's will, not by killing every soldier, but by dissolving the belief that survival could be earned through obedience or courage. The American public, too, absorbed a lesson about the new nature of war. Newspaper photos of leaflets drifting over Japan appeared alongside stories of the atomic bomb. Together they presented a portrait of warfare as a total system: intelligence, propaganda, and high technology fused into a single, overwhelming force. This understanding set the stage for decades of U.S. military investment in satellites, communications, and psychological operations, tools designed to dominate not only physical space, but cognitive space. Even in peacetime, the leaflets exerted a strange afterlife. Some were collected by GIs as souvenirs. Others entered archives and university collections. In their brittle pages, historians trace the genealogy of modern information warfare. They see how each phrase, each choice of font and illustration, reflected a calculated attempt to shape perception. These fragments are as much a part of the war's material culture as rifles or uniforms. They are the artifacts of a campaign that weaponized language itself. As the decades passed, Japan rebuilt itself into a pacifist democracy and an economic power. The cities that once burned became centers of commerce and culture. Yet every August, when bells toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the leaflets return in memory. Survivors speak of them with a mixture of gratitude and bitterness. Gratitude that some warnings were given, bitterness that the warnings proved hollow. This duality mirrors the legacy of the entire Pacific War: destruction and rebirth, terror and progress, tragedy and transformation. In the larger arc of history, the leaflet campaign over Japan represents the threshold between old and new war. It showed that industrial-age mass bombing could be paired with post-industrial information control. It foreshadowed a century in which satellites, drones, cyber tools, and social media would become the new leaflets, falling not from bomb bays but from data streams, infiltrating not cities but minds. The paper slips drifting over Nagasaki were, in retrospect, the ancestors of the digital messages that shape conflicts today, and yet Amid all the analysis, a simple image endures: a child standing in a rice field, catching a fluttering sheet of paper from the sky, reading words she barely understands, while high above, silver aircraft drone in the sunlight. That moment, suspended between knowledge and catastrophe, captures the entire essence of the campaign. It is the human face of psychological warfare, fragile, curious, fearful, and at the mercy of forces far beyond comprehension. As the narrator's voice fades over archival footage, leaflets scattering in the wind, survivors sifting through rubble, the mushroom cloud rising, at a final truth emerges. In modern war, connection can outweigh firepower. Information can erode resolve more deeply than shells, and the space between warning and annihilation can be as potent a weapon as any bomb. The paper war over Japan proved that technology's deadliest edge is not always steel or plutonium, but the human mind's capacity for fear, doubt, and surrender. Thus, the legacy of the American leaflet campaign endures, a cautionary tale and a blueprint, a gesture of mercy and a weapon of terror, a harbinger of the age when wars would be fought as much in the realm of perception as on the battlefield. In the thin sheets of paper that fell from the sky in 1945 lies a lesson for every generation since, that the battle for hearts and minds is not a metaphor, but a literal theater of war, and that the shadow of those leaflets still stretches across our own time.